Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started with some of the housekeeping. You're at the MMSA webinar series on long-term supply of critical minerals affected by permitting delays. My name's Susan Wager. I'm the host today, along with Betty Gibbs. And what we're going to do is we'll be recording this. It isn't being recorded right now. And ultimately, we'll post it on our website, so you'll have an opportunity to go back and view it again. If anybody doesn't get a chance to watch the whole thing, or if you know someone that didn't get to watch it, they'll have an opportunity to watch it. Typically, what we do is we allow the panelists to complete their presentations, and then we'll open it up to Q&A or chat, either one. You can find that at the bottom of your screen, and you'll be able to either ask questions or make comments. And Betty will help with fielding those. So do you want to get started, Betty, or shall we wait a few more minutes?
Let's go ahead and get started.
Okay, then I'll turn it over to Betty.
Okay, welcome to our webinar series. MMSA is an association of mineral resource professionals whose members represent all facets of mining and metallurgical interests, both domestic and internationally. We do have two guests today, Virginia McLemore and Sam Ballingrud. They will be talking about the long-term supply of critical minerals affected by permitting delays. One other thing I wanted to mention too is that the MMSA webinars are supported by the Jacqueline Foundation. This is MMSA function. We will be uploading the webinar to YouTube, and it can be accessed through the MMSA Net website. We will send out an email when the video is up and the other information, and then you can look at it again if you'd like, or send a link to your contacts. So I would like to introduce first Virginia McLemore, and she is a certified professional geologist and the principal senior economic geologist and minerals outreach liaison for the New Mexico Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources. And when you find her on the internet, you can find all of her amazing responsibilities. I don't know how she does it. So anyway, Ginger, go ahead. Thank you for
Can you
joining.
see my PowerPoint?
Yep, we see it.
Okay, great. Thank you for the invite. I do appreciate it. And this is a research topic of mine I've been working on for a number of years. First, would like to say that the New Mexico Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources, we are the State Geological Survey, and we are actually a research division of New Mexico Institute of Mining Technology. That's New Mexico Tech. And this invite actually stems from Society for Mining, Metallurgy, and Exploration. We have a number of technical briefing papers that we have written that you can access on the web. I've identified the two of them that are pertinent to this conversation: critical and strategic minerals, importance to the United States economy, and rare earths. And these briefing papers are geared for our legislatures, the legislator staff, the general public, and our SME members as well. So I do encourage you to take a look at these. So I'll first get started with what are critical minerals. So during the last administration, the presidential executive order was signed, and it identified critical minerals as those minerals that are identified to be a non-fuel mineral or mineral material essential to the economic and national security of the United States, from a supply chain that is vulnerable to disruption and that serves an essential function in the manufacturing of a product, the absence of which would have substantial consequences for the U.S. economy or national security. And it is interesting to note that the current administration also supports the same definition, and as you'll see in a little bit, has actually expanded the funding for these programs. So really in more common day English, critical minerals are what we use every day. They're needed in the military, the industrial, commercial products that we use. They're essential to renewable energy, as you will find out here in a minute. But these minerals are subject to a potential supply disruptions. And we certainly have seen the supply chinks happen throughout COVID. And this is, I'm afraid, going to be a way of life in the near future until we resolve some of these issues. And these critical minerals also form an essential function for products which there are very few or no satisfactory substitutes. And the absence of these minerals would cause severe economic, national security, or societal consequences. So I've shown here a periodic table, and it is keyed in color to critical minerals that we find in New Mexico. I apologize, I did not have time to redraft this for the United States, but we'll deal with New Mexico. And this was the critical minerals that were first identified in 2020. And then the U.S. Department of Energy, U.S. Department of Interior, and U.S. Department of Defense all got together, and they're the ones that actually define criticality and define these elements. And a lot of this is published on the USGS, U.S. Geological Society, U.S. Geological Survey, their website. Well, they got together last year, and they just released the 2022 critical minerals list. And now, whereas in last year, the one in 2020, they actually combined the platinum group elements and the rare earth group elements. So there was a smaller number. In 2022, they're now have separated the platinum group elements and the rare earth group elements. And in addition, they dropped uranium, rhenium, helium, and potassium or potash off the critical minerals list. I suspect a few of these will come back on in the next few years. And zinc and nickel were added to the list. And all of this really stems from this graphic that we see in the USGS mineral commodity summaries that they publish every year. And this is from the recent, this year's 2022 publication. And as you can see, I'm not sure if you see my pointer or not, but this shows all of the minerals that we import and that we actually import greater than 50% of. And at the top, where you see the blue bar going across all the way, those are minerals that we import 100%. And then on the right side of the graphic, you can actually see the countries that we import these minerals from. And you can find this online at the USGS website. Just go in and Google Mineral Commodity Summaries, USGS, and you can get right to this publication. I do want to mention, though, and I've kind of hinted at it, is that critical minerals will change with time, and they also will change with country. And two examples that I like to use is table salt, NaCl. Everything, we use it every single day. Even if you're allergic to salt or you can't use salt, we depend on salt. Well, back in prehistoric times, salt was used as a preservative, tanning leather, stock, mining. And so salt was actually a critical mineral at that time. Societies flocked to areas where they could get adequate supplies of salt, and even sometimes salaries were given in terms of salt. Today, of course, we take salt for granted. But then another example of how it changes with country is that today, I would say that copper is considered a critical mineral by Japan. Japan does not have any production of copper, and yet they need it for a lot of the products that they manufacture and then import. So why are critical minerals so important? Well, the production of many of these commodities is highly concentrated in a few countries. Once again, I've shown the periodic table. On the left, you can see the elements are shown in various shades of red. And a lot of these minerals come from China, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Russia. And these are not always the most friendly countries to the United States, and the supplies are not always the most reliable. On the other hand, we also import a number of commodities from Australia, Brazil, and Canada, and Chile, and you can see those on the right side of this graphic. China's share of global production has increased over the past 3 decades for many mineral commodities. And indeed, it has been a subject of great interest for a lot of us and a lot of manufacturers. And once again, this is a periodic table that shows how this production and the time share sequence of this production over the years. The other issue that comes in when we talk about critical minerals is that many of these commodities are for advanced technologies and they're only recovered as byproducts. For example, tellurium. We think of tellurium associated with gold, and we see gold tellurium mines all over the world, but there is no standalone mine that produces just tellurium. And in fact, most of the tellurium production actually comes from copper refineries as a byproduct of the smelter wastes. So you really got to go far down that line. And as we move more and more towards heap leaching in copper, we lose all of that kind of byproduct production. So this is one of the other concerns that we're facing. These 4 graphs, and I've got the reference down below, and I can email anyone the link if you need to. It is a USGS publication, and it just gives you an idea once again of, and it's color coded, of the different commodities that are affected by disruption potential, the different commodities that are disrupted by trade exposure, the economic vulnerability, which is shown kind of in that beige brownish color, and then supply risk. And this particular document goes into great detail on a lot of these on how critical minerals are affected by so much other than just the geology. And the other point that I'd really like to also get through to you is that if we're going to move to clean energy technologies, and I hate that term clean energy because they're really not clean. They may be clean once they're built and they start providing the energy, but there's a lot of mining and other manufacturing that has to go on beforehand that still has a lot of CO2 emissions and other environmental consequences. But anyway, let's say we do want to reduce CO2 emissions. We do want to go to a clean energy economy. In fact, in order to do that, it's going to require a whole lot more critical minerals and copper in order to achieve this. And this graph shows that very nicely. It shows the commodities that are needed for the average electric car as compared to conventional car. It also shows the average commodities that are needed for wind and solar generation and compare it to nuclear and coal and natural gas power plants. So we have to realize that there's a cost and an additional risk by going to carbon-free society. This particular graph just shows some of the variety of uses of a lot of these critical minerals. And I do want to emphasize that copper is not a critical mineral in the United States, Canada, Australia, or the European Union. But I'll come back here to copper in a few minutes. Here's a graphic, and I apologize to the author. I forgot where I got it, but it demonstrates the amount of material, the tonnage that we need. This would be an average mega factory that produces nickel, cadmium, lithium ion batteries, and how much raw materials have to go in order to produce all of these batteries. And a lot of these batteries are these itty bitty little guys that go into our cell phones and our solar panels and all the other devices we use. You are looking at tons, thousands of tons of lithium, nickel, cobalt, and graphite that have to go and have to feed this factory. And in order for this factory to make all of the little batteries, and this is just one factory. So you start to understand the amount of material that's needed. So what are some of the programs being developed to address the availability of critical minerals? As I mentioned early, the Department of Interior, Department of Energy, Department of Defense are all working very serious on this. They have significant money that did come out of the infrastructure bill that the current administration has signed and is in full swing. The USGS, one of their major programs, is this Earth Mapping Resources Initiative. And here, this is where the USGS is partnering with the state geological surveys, yeah, me, and all of the others that are throughout the 50 states plus Puerto Rico. And they are providing money to look at where these deposits are found, what deposits host critical minerals, and where we find them. And we are doing mapping, geophysical surveys, LIDAR, which is an elevation modeling, and really trying to get a handle on what is needed before the expiration and before the permits really have to go into being written. The Department of Energy is doing the same thing, and they have funded in one program 13 different areas to be looking at core CM. It's essentially the rare earth elements and critical minerals that are found in these coal deposits. So perhaps the idea is that we can take the coal waste, we can take the coal that's being used in the power generation, and maybe we can also get some of these critical minerals out of the coal residue that remains after the ash. And that's what these programs are focused on. The DOE also has a lot of other funding that they're getting out to looking at recovery programs to actually get into different processing and how we can process and actually recover some of these critical minerals. The Department of Defense is letting out grants as well. I do want to go back. I am a geologist. That is my specialty. That's what I know the most about. And one of the things that the USGS did is they partnered with Canada, Queensland, and the Australians and their national geological surveys and their top economic geologies. And they came up with a way that we can actually classify deposits, but with a focus on critical minerals. And they came up with this system where they come up with mineral systems approach, and they kind of have divided the different types of deposits into the mineral systems and then start to identify where critical minerals are found in these not only deposits but the whole mineral system. Here's an example of the mineral systems approach for our typical porphyry, copper, molybdenum, gold. And you can see that we have a schematic here on the left that shows the different types of deposits, the different geologic terrains, tectonic settings that we're looking at. They have the different deposit types listed here, the principal commodities. And then, as I said, it is critical minerals focused. So they do have the list of critical minerals. Some of these Earth MRI projects will actually go and start looking at some of these deposits and mineral systems in more detail and identify where in these systems we can find critical minerals. And then it's up to the mining engineers and the metallurgists and the other process engineers to actually figure out how we get them out of the ground and how we can actually process them and get them into the system to be made into the products we use. Some of the challenges, well, the first one I always will say will be geologic availability. Does the mineral resource exist? Do we have the critical minerals in this area or this type of deposit? But then we start getting even more complex. Can we extract and process it? Do we have the technical availability to get that critical mineral out of that mineral deposit? And that's not trivial. The environmental and social aspects are always going to play a role. And I will come back to this here in a few minutes too. It's our social license to operate. And this is going to be true for critical minerals like it's true for all of the mines that are going into production. And it is political availability. How are the governments going to influence this? And this is where Sam will talk a little bit more, because it's the governments that set the stage for a lot of the permitting. And how easy is it going to get these permitted in a realistic time fashion that we can actually get the financing to pay for all this? And that rolls into the economic availability. Can we produce it at a cost that users are willing and able to pay for? How much of the mineral do we need? That's always an issue. Tellurium is one of those unknowns. There's only a few producers in the world, and we really do not know how much tellurium is being produced. We really don't even know how much tellurium the industry needs because it's such a competitive market. But that doesn't help us at the geology end or at the stage of putting together projects and ultimately mines. Certainly, are there enough materials in the pipeline to meet the demand for these technologies and other uses? Recycling is going to play a part. And the engineers are going to have to look at other substitutions. We're not going to be able to provide all of these critical minerals, and substitutions are also going to play a role. And where do we have environmental issues? For instance, a lot of your rare earth and beryllium deposits, both of which are critical minerals, they're also associated with uranium and thorium. And industry in the past has often rejected or not looked at develop certain deposits because of those radioactive issues. That goes into permitting. The small volumes of strategic critical minerals that are needed, yeah, we're talking about thousands of tons, but that is quite different from the millions of tons of copper that we have to mine in order to get to what is needed. And that makes them price sensitive. And that price is quite volatile. And it's hard for investors to really start to understand the financing that goes into making these mines. There's a number of other things. Monopolies often get into the way. And there's one item here in the United States that most folks don't understand, and it's called conflict minerals. There is a Conflict Minerals Trade Act that actually says that we are not supposed to provide major revenue, that is, to buy certain commodities from countries that provide revenue to armed fractions, to rebellions, to the kinds of things that we don't really like to see in what's going on in some of the countries in Africa. And unfortunately, that is like cobalt. That is also diamonds. If any of you saw the movie Blood Diamond, this is exactly what this act was heading for. And I do want to bring everyone back to this concept of a life cycle of a mine. And a mine has a beginning, it has an end. It may go on for hundreds of years, but still, at some point, it does have an end. And this is another factor that plays into how we get deposits from the geological end of things out into production and on to getting these commodities moving out. Exploration takes many years. Permitting can take greater than 10 years. And the operators at a lot of these deposits are not going to jeopardize their primary commodity for a potential risky byproduct. Like many of your gold operators will not even think of putting in a tellurium circuit because it could jeopardize their gold circuit. And in this graph, what I've tried to show is how mining has changed with time. I've shown here in blue the steps in mining. I'm sorry, here in yellow, the steps that were required before the 1970s. I mean, essentially, you went out, did exploration, you did prospecting, you found a deposit, you start trying to move it into mine development, you go into operations, and then into production, and then you're good. And a lot of those projects you walked away from. Well, in the 1970s to 2000, we started seeing that we now have environmental issues and we have other issues that come into play. And I've kind of showed these steps in green, where not only do we may have a little bit more going up in the exploration end in terms of a feasibility study, but then in the actual development, mine development, and actual production, we've got to have environmental assessments and environmental impact statements done. We now have to have mines permitted. And we're always looking to how is this mine going to look like at the final closure. And certainly after 2000, we have refined this more. At the exploration stage, we're looking at more studies like scoping studies, pre-feasibility studies, and then feasibility studies. And then we start with the mine development. But at the end, we always are going to have this post-closure monitoring, and this could go on to perpetuity in some of the legacy mines. But in mines that are permitted today, we want that period of post-closure and monitoring to be a finite. And so this concept also enters in, where do critical minerals fall into this? And The other thing I'd like to come back to is, why isn't copper a critical mineral in the United States? I get asked this question a lot. And it really goes down to the definition of critical minerals. We have a ready available supply of copper in the United States. The first graph on the left is from John Price that shows in red the amount of capital consumption in copper. In green, it shows population. Population's increasing. And the line in blue is what's so dramatic, is that we're going to need 22 times more production than what we needed 100 years ago. But if we go to a zero CO2 emissions, we're going to need even more copper than what we need today. And those deposits have to be found and be put close to being to where they can be permanent in the next few years, or we will have a copper shortage and copper could come on that critical minerals list. But right now, this other table here, and I hate tables, but this does come out of the USGS commodity mineral summaries, and it does show the production and the reserves. We have a lot of reserves of copper, so in on the plate. So it'll be a while before copper becomes a critical mineral in the United States. So in summary, critical minerals are non-fuel minerals that are essential to the economy and defense of the United States. They are subject to potential side disruptions. Both administrations, and this could be one of the few things that both administrations have agreed on, but they have tasked the Department of Interior, Department of Energy, and Department of Defense with looking at critical minerals research, starting with the geological deposits all the way up to how we process and separate them and get these critical minerals into the manufacturers. Critical minerals can be standalone deposits, but a lot of times they are byproducts and co-products, or they are trace amounts in known deposits. And not always the mine itself does not always get credit for those deposits. Critical minerals are going to be needed if we're going to move to a green CO2 free economy. And solving the critical minerals shortage will involve more than exploration, mining, and processing, but we are going to have to look at changes in permitting, and yet we still have to have that social license to operate, as well as maybe even looking at different business models for financing some of these commodities. This slide here, I just am showing very quickly some of the projects that we've worked on here in New Mexico. Down here in the Cornudas Mountains, we have Wind Mountain here, and it's eudialyte. That is the major commodity, the major mineral. The eudialyte does carry rare earth minerals, but we have found some other rare earth minerals that are in the nepheline syenite that could maybe enhance the rare earth mineral production from this mountain should it ever go into production, or it could actually interfere. In critical minerals, we're not always looking at grade, we're looking at minerals. Can you get that mineral out of that rock? And then we start talking about grade. The deposit, the photos that I'm showing here on the right are bastnasite fluorite system in the Guyanas Mountains. Bastnasite is that middle slide showing that nice little light brown tan hexagonal crystal. It is embedded with the fluorite, and it's a matter of whether there is enough material there, or even more important, whether someone will drill and perhaps find the source of these small thin bastnasite fluorite veins. And so with that, I will show you one of my favorite slides of turkeys that did finally perform well for me in the Guyanas Mountains, but we will take any questions after Sam presents his story. So with that, I will stop sharing and let Sam take over.
Okay, thanks, Ginger. That was very interesting. I've always learned more stuff. Our next presenter is Sam Ballangrud, and he is an associate in the Environmental Safety and Health Group at Squire Patton Boggs. And go ahead, Sam, unmute and share your screen.
Thank you, Betty. And thank you, Betty and Susan, both for having me here. This is my first time presenting to this organization here, and I'm very excited for the opportunity and very thankful for it. So thank you for that. I'm going to talk today a little bit about, I'm trying to figure out the share screen. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about sharing about the permitting process for critical minerals. So we talk, first off, Betty, can you just confirm that my screen is shared appropriately?
Yes, we see your sign. We
Excellent,
see
thank you. So after Ginger talked a lot about the what critical minerals are and some of the technical questions about how we get them, how we use them, and the extraordinary increase in demand we're going to have as we kind of pursue this green transition, which everybody seems so excited about. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the permitting process here, because we take a lot of political will, we take a lot of industry need, we take a lot of popular awareness of this issue, and then we put it up right against the federal bureaucracy. And I'm not going to spoil anything by telling you who wins in that fight. So, as mentioned before, a lot has changed about critical minerals and about how the federal government's awareness of this issue, and the increasing awareness of the fact that a lot of these critical minerals come from sources that we cannot necessarily trust to be reliable in the future. If these critical minerals have important defense applications, if they're going to be extremely rare in the future, then they're going to be limited, and they're going to have this kind of dichotomy where we want to increase spending on certain projects, where we want to increase our reliance on these minerals, but with an uncertain supply, that becomes more difficult. And not only more difficult in matters of we just can't get them, but it's also more difficult for funding. It's more difficult for investors. It's more difficult for everybody to be certain about the supply of these minerals. And so there's a broad awareness that we want to have greater domestic supplies of these minerals here. So how is that, and how is some of these recent laws and executive orders coming up against the current existing permitting framework here? What has changed and what remains the same? So I won't repeat what Ginger said. I could not do half as good a job as she did. What I'm going to say is that there are several definitions of critical minerals. There's probably a colloquial definition of minerals we consider critical to ourselves. As Ginger pointed out, critical minerals are often a context-sensitive question. Certain countries and certain industries will consider minerals critical to them, but may not be to another person, to another country, in another point in time. So there are, again, several different definitions. Executive order, Ginger pointed out, had one definition here. The current definition I'd like to talk about comes from the Energy Act that was published, that was passed recently here. The Energy Act directed the Department of the Interior to create a list of critical minerals being defined largely by the criteria we've already talked about with the Ginger before, but also by the Secretary's sort of continuing evaluation of it. As Ginger mentioned, these things change. The things change over time, the things change over by industry, so on and so forth. So the Secretary of the Interior has the ability to promulgate this list and then to adjust this list as time goes on, add items, detract items, as the case may be. So the full list down there, for those of us who do not know the periodic table as well and do not necessarily follow along with this is the list of everything that is on there. I have not yet spoken to anybody in the industry who thinks that any of these items are surprises or unusual to be included in there. From aluminum to zirconium. And as Ginger mentioned before, we have a lot of minerals now that are important for electric vehicle batteries, for lithium-ion batteries, nickel, and lithium, cobalt, things like that. So that's the current list. That's sort of the what we just had come out from the Department of the Interior, as noted on the slide there. That was on February 24th, 2022. So this is still relatively new. This is still relatively a recent development in there. And so when I'm talking about this and the impact of this designation and some of these other changes, what I want you to keep in mind here is that this is new. This is a recent change, and federal bureaucracy does not necessarily move at the speed of the industry. And so a 3-month-old change from February 24th, 2022 is still brand spanking new to them. So in that context, I should say. And so here again, this is the statutory definition here that was passed in the Energy Act. The only thing I want to mention here, because it's actually very consistent with the definition Ginger said earlier, is that has a high risk of that this is what the Secretary determines, right? I actually omitted that language for space, but this is what the Secretary determines, that the critical mineral has a high risk of supply chain disruption there. And so that will cover the entire spectrum of potential disruptions we talked about before. That's going to be trade disruption, that's going to be supply disruption, that's going to be unfriendly countries, that's going to be any reason that these could not be from a reliable source that will indicate that they are potential for supply chain disruption. And that will be things like rule of law even too. And on that point, I want to make a quick I'm not going to try to share the slide because I'm certain I would screw up the technical aspect of that. But when we're talking about supply chain disruption here, I want to focus too on some of the more practical considerations about the trade outlook. So we have become very accustomed here since the early 90s to a very clear trade outlook here, that there's going to be, that there are tariffs and there are restrictions, there are import quotas and there's limitations and things like that. But broadly speaking, these are things that are handled by the rule of law, handled by the court of, and handled by sort of a predictable process here. Recently, though, we've seen that is perhaps not the case. We've seen political considerations, domestic and international, creep into other countries' awareness and approach to whether or not they are allowing export of their own materials, minerals, things like that. And that, broadly speaking, means the trade outlook is more concerning for a lot of people and for a lot of industries. We're not taking it for granted anymore that you can get these kind of things, that if this country isn't overtly hostile to us, then we can still do trade with them, then we can still rely on it. Maybe we pay more, maybe there are tariffs, but we can still get the stuff from them. That's changing. And that's changing not only because of recent political events in Europe, but it's changing because frankly, the global trade consensus is not as robust as it may have once been. So recently, you may have seen in the news that Indonesia, which is a perfectly friendly country, has limited the export of palm oil. Palm oil is not a critical mineral, but it's important for a lot of industries. Indonesia is sort of the main event when it comes to the exportation of palm oil. And I don't want to speculate too much here, but people have said that they limited the export of palm oil to help the pricing of domestic cooking oil. So the voting constituencies in that country have a lot of concern over the price of goods, of the price of their the food they need to eat, and so they put pressure on the government to limit the export. And there's a method to bring down the cost. They limited the export of that, which has a domestic impact, which obviously is the most concern to them, but also has a broad international impact. And that thing has created a lot of surprise to a lot of people that would happen, because that is such a big export for them. And it has such a need for other countries to rely upon those important industries to get them. And then it was just cut off. It wasn't cut off because of a rebellion or revolution or anything like that. It was cut off for domestic concerns. Probably won't be that long, probably won't be the end of the world with domestic supplies, and the various amounts that have already been exported will probably be enough slack in the system. But things like that are very possible, and they're going to continue to be possible. And I think we're going to continue to see more of that. So that's just one point I want to make there, kind of the practical political aspect of it. We can talk about the law, we can talk about the permitting aspect, we can talk about all this kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, the law is, I would say subservient to, but is affected by these sort of external political shocks that are outside the context of any sort of law. So as we talked about before, practically, politically, the critical minerals, the demand is going to be increasing. And what I want to make a point here too, is that demand is going to be increasing independent of any external shocks, right? So if you talk to people, talk to a lot of economists, there's a lot of concern that we're going to be going into a recession, that the amount of inflation we have is too high, and that there's a potential for inflation. Not a sure thing, but it's certainly possible, and there's some concern about that. I won't speculate too much on the day-to-day aspect of the market there, but whatever we talk about for the broader economic outlook here, I would be quite confident saying that the demand for these critical minerals is going to be very robust, because as Ginger mentioned earlier, two of the main uses of these critical minerals are for domestic defense application here. They go into high-tech tracking and targeting systems and things like that, and also green energy, clean energy, nuclear power, solar panels, electric vehicles, things of that nature. Those are things that, because of things like the Paris Accords and because of recent events in Europe, are going to have very robust demand going forward that I think is going to be largely independent of any concern about that. And the other thing to mention here too is that there is also a growing concern that domestic, we're not only talking about the raw materials here, but also the finished products, right? So there's a growing concern that the finished products that require a lot of these minerals are going to be restricted here. So not only do we need to build a domestic supply of the minerals that go into this, but we need to be concerned about a domestic supply of the finished products. And here what I'm mainly talking about are semiconductors and chips. Chips and semiconductors are often sourced from friendly countries and from countries that are very reliable, but that are perhaps more vulnerable to external shock than we might like. And so building up a domestic supply of that will allow us to avoid that. correct. And so when we talk, we talk about the demand for critical minerals, not only are we talking about how we need to source the raw materials, but there's also growing concern in the U.S. and European Union that we need to onshore some of the semiconductors, some of the chip manufacturing, and that itself will also be a driver of the demand for some of these minerals here. Not all of them. Obviously, there are 50 minerals, and so we're not talking about every single one of them here. But for large sectors of these critical minerals, there's going to be robust demand, independent of a lot of these broader concerns, spurred by government spending and spurred by the broader need to prioritize certain energy transition technologies here. So, as you see there on the bottom here, this is certainly not something that is new. The European Union has, at least since 2011, had its own critical minerals list. The United States has, for decades, actually had a method of prioritizing, giving some effect to critical minerals. Recently, that's gotten some new life to it. But these are things that have been on policymakers' mind for long periods of time that are just now kind of coming to the fore. And so we have also mention the competitiveness bill here, the so-called competitiveness bill. I won't focus too much on that because a bill is a bill, and show me when it's law. So, and that's not yet law, it's not been yet passed, but one of the things in the competitiveness bill is a supply chain resiliency program that will build upon some of these broader concerns and aspects of how we're approaching critical minerals and how the supply of those. So all this is to say that we have political will to promote domestic supplies, that there's awareness that we need these, that these are critical to defense, that these are critical to green energy, things that get a lot of people on board with things that have broad mass market appeal. So political will, we need to have these on board. We need to have these here. We need to make our chips ourselves or secure the supply chain for those. How does that look on the ground? And so let me tell you the favorite question that any lawyer can ask, right? If you've ever spoken to a lawyer, this is the question you should be asking, and this is the question your lawyer should be asking you. So what? So what that we have all this demand? So what that we have all this increasing concern for the long-term supply of these minerals? So what that we have a critical minerals designation? What's going to actually change at the primary bottleneck? Well, one of the main bottlenecks of critical mineral development domestically and mining, the permitting process here. So what is the immediate effect of that critical minerals designation we talked about before? Well, very little. That's sort of the brutal fact of it, I'm sorry to tell you here. So the infrastructure bill and the Energy Act recently two recent bills that have done something on the critical minerals front that have sort of tried to promote the domestic development of these products here. But taking a step back even from the specifics there, and I'm not going to go line by line of the bills with you. It's not that exciting. It's not that important. But broadly speaking, what did these two bills do? What is the Energy Act, which gave the Secretary the ability to create the critical minerals list? What does the infrastructure bill here do that, as mentioned before, has some impact on the validity of critical minerals? Well, they promote agency coordination. They try to reduce duplication of efforts, and they try to give they direct the agencies to promote guidance on the permitting process, and they issue non-binding exhortations to act more quickly. They don't actually fundamentally change the permitting process. So why is there this disconnect, right? So why do we have, on the one hand, this great political recognition that we need to do something about this? The industry is behind it, the politicians are behind it, law is not behind it, Congress seems to pass laws about it, and the actual action taken, which is not, which some would say would not be quite measured up to the task. Well, first off, let me say that the permitting process here takes 7 to 10 years on average. So permits take longer than that, some permits get quicker than that, but on average, you're talking 7 to 10 years. So sort of, as you can imagine from some of the bare fact of how long this takes here, this is a complex process. And I don't have to tell you that getting a mine off the ground and permitted is bewilderingly technically complex, and its process, its interaction with the federal government is just simply very demanding from a technical question of that as well. So broadly speaking, that sort of technically demanding and complex task, taking a mine from scratch and rebuilding it, developing it, and permitting it, it touches on so many foundational environmental laws, right? That when you're trying to take a mine from infancy to mature to actual getting stuff out of the ground, you're touching on NEPA, CERCLA, the Clean Air Act, the Water Act, the Toxic Substance Control Act, RCRA, so on and so forth here. These are the foundational environmental laws of the country. These are the sort of bare, the bare bones of how this country regulates environmental law. And so if to address the permitting of that, it touches on a lot of concerns and a lot of different equities. So recently, I was interviewed or gave some comments to Greenwire at E&E's Greenwire, and what I said was that if we're going to increase the amount of critical minerals that we're taking out of the ground in even the medium term, even the 5 to 10 year term, we need to do something like a TSA pre-check for mining, right? Because as it stands, we touch, like most environmental laws, we touch on all these foundational environmental laws. And so we need to do something to get mining to the fore of that. We need to materially address the substance of this review process rather than doing agency coordination or removing duplication of efforts if we want to get these things done in 2 to 5 years as opposed to 7 to 10 on average. So that's sort of the basic problem we have, is that because we're touching on all of these laws, that just gives us an enormous amount of concern and different political equities we have about how we're going to be addressing those laws, because we're talking about mining here. Basically, we have a specific problem that is subject to a general framework here. We're touching that general framework and getting a lot more concern, and those same politicians who are on board for a lot of the broader concerns we have about promoting domestic concerns may have more reservations about how we touch those there. The other thing to note is that everything we do in this process, so long as we are under NEPA, CERCLA, Clean Air, Clean Water, so on and so forth, everything we do in this process is subject to judicial review. And so you might think, well, maybe we could get some sort of, maybe Congress will enact, but maybe we could do something else to prioritize the permitting process. And that may well be possible, but everything we do to for lack of a better word, cut corners, and that's not really what I'm talking about here, cutting corners, but you get what I mean here. What we're trying to do to try to really expedite this process here is going to be subject to judicial review, right? So if you get the agency to move a lot faster, you're still going to have the problem of people saying, you didn't consider this aspect of it here, this other thing you relied upon isn't good. And this is where we come back to sort of the technically demanding aspect of it, that because these things are technically demanding, that there's so much room for argument here. And I don't mean technically demanding because it's hard to calculate a math problem here. I mean technically demanding because these things are difficult to fully resolve with any great scientific certainty. So if you're doing mining, you may well be talking about groundwater issues. Groundwater issues are very technically demanding and complex. Modeling groundwater flow, understanding how that operates there it's very hard. And so to say that, we're going to move a lot faster here, you're still going to subject yourself to saying something like, well, your groundwater model was put together with the gum and old glue. Like it wasn't any good. You didn't consider this aspect of it, and your modeling wasn't appropriate there, and you didn't resolve the differences between model A and model B in a permissible fashion there. So that's sort of the broad problem we have, and why some of these designations here are not always going to necessarily get down that 7 to 10 year time frame into a more civilized, into a shorter time frame there. And so that ties into a little bit what Ginger was talking about earlier here. We have technical concerns and technical constraints that a lot of these critical minerals are byproducts of others, and that getting these is less straightforward, we might say, than mining something like coal, which you would have in a vein in a relatively distinguishable fashion there. And so it is different, a lot faster, I think, to get get critical minerals out of an existing mine than it would be to get it out of a brand new mine here. So this is sort of I almost call it the worst case scenario, but this is sort of the model, right? So we talk about going from A to Z on the life cycle of a mine. That may not always be necessary because we're not always talking about doing that. We're not talking about building a mine specifically for hafnium or something like that. So that's, I'm giving you a lot of the sort of the dismal view of it here, that is a potential problem we have, but we should also note that that's not always going to be the case for everybody here. So after saying all that, after addressing all those issues here, what exactly do these recent reforms do? What does the Energy Act do? What does the critical minerals designation do? I was a little too cute when I said earlier that they do very little. What do they actually do? Well, they sort of give us what got us here in the first place. I call it the hair of the dog: more procedural reform, more concern about how we are doing the agency coordination here. So we're not changing the fundamental framework, but we are changing how the agencies operate within that framework here. So to avoid major fights over reforms to the foundational laws we discussed, the focus has been on streamlining and adjusting the procedure within that framework here. So can you all still see my screen? I think you still can. So the for example, now that we have the critical minerals designation here, what does that mean for us going forward, and what does that mean there too? Well, because of that critical minerals designation here, there's going to be an effort by agencies when they're considering projects that touch on these minerals here to, I'm going to quote here from the law. I promised I wouldn't read from the law earlier, but I'm going to do it briefly here now. That now, for projects affecting these critical minerals, the agencies will, quote, avoid duplication of effort, prevent unnecessary paperwork, minimize delays of the administration of applicable laws, and the issuance of permits and authorizations necessary to explore, develop, and produce critical minerals, and to construct critical mineral manufacturing facilities in accordance with applicable environmental and land management laws. So that's that. It's a directive to the agencies that they're going to avoid duplication of efforts, prevent unnecessary paperwork, and minimize delays. Obviously, it won't surprise you that what people believe is unnecessary paperwork and what is an unnecessary delay is going to vary highly from person to person here. And especially when you have several different agencies, as we talked about before, we know these things are technically demanding and touch on a lot of different aspects of the problem here. You're going to be dealing with a lot of different state and federal agencies. Whose fault, what the delay is there, whose fault that unnecessary paperwork there is going to vary highly depending on your circumstance. So federal bureaucracy is federal bureaucracy. I don't mean to talk down about it, but the practical matter is that things like saying avoid unnecessary paperwork to 4 or 5 different federal agencies coordinating with each other is not necessarily going to be a magic bullet for reducing permitting time in a meaningful fashion. But not all is lost on that, because I do want to draw attention to what's called Fast 41. Fast 41 is a Obama-era reform, I think it was 2015 or 16, that addressed, as you might imagine from the title, the Surface Transportation Act. So the recent infrastructure bill codified the Fast 41 framework, which was originally set to sunset back in December 2020, I think. But now it's been extended because of the recent infrastructure bill. And what it does is it establishes what's called Federal Permitting Improvement Council, which I highly encourage you people to go visit and go kind of check it out there, because it is a very interesting framework about how the federal agencies are really sort of meaningfully addressing the permitting process and sort of streamlining it there. It only applies to what are called covered projects as defined by statute, which are going to be for lack of a better word, large projects there. So in smaller mines and smaller permitting projects, they are not necessarily going to qualify for that framework. But what it does is the Fast 41 framework not only gives sort of these exhortations about reducing, the amount of unnecessary duplication there, it makes a more tangible reform in how the federal agencies operate by designating lead agencies there, by giving one particular agency a lead agency role and giving them some certain statutory powers to kind of bowl through some of these problems we've had and some of these coordination difficulties we've had when you're dealing with the problem of coordinating all these different and disparate federal agencies there. Recently, as part of the infrastructure bill, the Permitting Council was given the ability to add categories to covered projects to what qualifies for its process there. So recently, I think it was January of this year, they voted to add mining as an acceptable category there too. So for the first time, mining projects are now able to take advantage of this framework here. And as I talked earlier about, maybe some skepticism about whether or not these other changes would address the permitting delays we've seen about before, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but looking at it and reviewing it, I think there has been some meaningful reform and speed from the Fast 41 process there. So the industry should take a good look at the Fast 41 process there and this new qualification under the mining that was recently added to it that could really make a meaningful difference for some of these projects here. And Fast 41 framework doesn't necessarily include the critical minerals designation there. The energy bill and the Fast 41 framework aren't talking to each other in that manner, for lack of a better word. But just because of that doesn't necessarily mean that they aren't helpful and complementary to one another, right? So when you're dealing with the permitting process here, one of the things you have to do is to engage with all these stakeholders and to make your own case. And one of the things you can do is say, look, I'm not bound by the critical minerals framework. I'm not bound by the Energy Act here, but this still informs the process. Like, you should still consider us and still be able to make us cut to the top of the line and still sign up on a project because the federal government has recognized the need for these kind of things. So they're not necessarily on the same page and coextensive in that regard, but they're still a lot of practical ways you can try to use them together when you're talking to congressmen, when you're talking to agencies, talking to state and local government to build the case about permitting. So the competitiveness bill is another aspect of it here. I won't talk too much about it again because show me it when it's passed, but it establishes, or one of its current drafts would establish, the Council on Manufacturing Industrial Innovation Functions that is charged with harmonizing the federal permitting process relating to manufacturing and industrial innovation as appropriate. That's like Fast 41, like the Energy Act here. That's going to depend a lot on the other powers it is given and how much authority is given, not only authority by statute, but also money, funding, personnel, things like that. But that is one potential way it could come up again in the relatively near future in the competitiveness bill about how that's going to address the critical mineral supply. And of course, manufacturing industrial innovation is appropriate. There are plenty of ways to make cases for I keep saying rare earth elements, for critical minerals to apply for that. We talk about the use of critical minerals in cutting edge energy and defense applications. Well, that's just one of them right there. That's a manufacturing industrial innovation, if you ask me. So, and this all stems back to Executive Order 14017. I believe Ginger talked about that. That's not too exciting, but that was an executive order a couple of years ago saying that we need to address the supply chain problems we have here. So, and as I said before, there's, yes, that's the right one. There are a lot of different ways to go about this here. And I've been talking for a while, so I'm going to breeze through this last little slide or two. Federal permitting, many would not even call it an unsolved problem. Many people say it's an existing framework, get used to it. But I think there's a broad concern and broad recognition that it is perhaps too long, and 7 to 10 years is a lot to ask for industries, for investors, for the communities who may or may not be subject to these mines being developed in there. And so we want to make this process a little bit faster, but we want to make it a little bit faster without cutting any corners, without really losing anything in the process here. It's the nexus of a lot of competing interests. So it's going to just involve a lot of different concerns of state, local, federal government. The people have to live next to it. The industry has to use it. And environmental concerns permeate everything it does, from groundwater contamination to clean air aspect to tailings disposal, everything like that. So in the efforts we've talked about before have all been agency-side adjustments to their internal processes here. That's going to have some effect. I don't want to know. The Energy Act was just passed. We just had this designation here. It is far too soon to say the Energy Act and the critical minerals designation has a minimal impact, has a light impact there. We need to game it out. We need to see what happens here. But it's probably not going to be having the time we're talking about permitting here. But without addressing the fundamental environmental laws, NEPA, CERCLA, et cetera, and without making a separate process, a TSA pre-check specifically for critical minerals mining, that's about what we're going to do. That's about all the federal government's going to be able to really do to address this issue and to meaningfully reform the process by speeding up its own process and its own internal coordination in that regard. So all of this is to say that for all the industry excitement, for all the problems and concerns we have about getting the permitting done faster and by getting the critical minerals out of the ground from the reliable domestic sources, the basic rules for permitting and the basic process is not going to change. It has not changed. If you're going to undergo a permitting process for a mine, you need to work quickly. You need to build a plan. You need to build a plan and a framework and funding for that before you go public. People who want to get their mine permitted, people in the permitting process for any type of project, mine or otherwise, often run into the problem where it's announced that they have concerns or announced that they want to go forward with it, but they don't have a concrete plan to hit the ground running. And so opposition coalesces around it. There are unanswered questions about mitigation, and it goes upside down pretty quickly after that. So the basic rules remain: do that beforehand, and then you go public and you say mitigation efforts out the gate, and you show people that you've done your homework in that regard. You engage with stakeholders early, you build local support, and you show people that this will have concrete, tangible benefits for your community, because it will bring clean jobs. It will bring, well, probably not clean jobs. It will bring jobs to your community and will bring environmental lifeline to a lot of these rural communities that are in desperate need of it. Despite all of this, the last thing I want to note is that American mining remains the cleanest and greenest in the world. If we're going to use these products, if we want critical minerals, if we want to use this, American mines have got to be the place to do it. Because if you're concerned about the environment, you want this to be happening in the US with our environmental standards, with our environmental monitoring, with our robust non-governmental organizations that keep a close eye on these things. This is the place to do it in a clean, green fashion. And I think that's something to be very proud of here, even as we talk about some of the difficulties we've had in the permitting process. So that is about all of it. That's me, very handsome man, if I say so myself. I'm an associate at Square Patent Boggs. Square Patent Boggs is a large international law firm, offices across the country. I work out of the Denver office here. In fact, I was just in the Warsaw office for about a month. In Poland, had a great time there. So anyway, feel free to reach out to me directly at my email address there. My name, I guarantee you, is pretty unique. You're not going to have trouble finding me if you try to Google me. But apart from that, Ginger and I are available for questions as you see fit. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sam. That was really interesting. I would have one comment before we go to the questions. We do have a few questions, and that is that in the US, we have very few smelters or final processing facilities that turn these mineral concentrates into final products. In many cases, the companies have to send their concentrates to other countries like China and Indonesia, and they will not send back the refined metals. They only turn them into products in those countries. And this is another big supply problem that at some point we're going to have to address. And trying to permit a smelter or final processing facility in this country is pretty difficult. And some of the places that we have had those are no longer in operation. So let's go to some of the questions. First, one of our attendees wants to have links to the reports, and this was during Ginger's talk. I think what we'll do is we'll just collect links from Ginger and Sam and add them to our document that has detail about the questions and answers.
And Betty,
and also those links are in the slides too. Sam?
No, I was gonna say I can send you some links too. Once we're done here, I got some other stuff to do, but at some point today, I'll send you, the link to Fast 41, the Energy Act, things like that. That I think would be helpful for everybody.
Yeah, great. Okay, we have a comment from. This is more of a comment than a question, but you all can address it. The presentation is very well done, and this was toward the end of Ginger's presentation, and packed full of facts and understanding of the issues involved. This critical minerals policy is top-down driven. We are mining professionals supposedly educated. Why are we just going along? Clean energy isn't clean, it isn't efficient, it isn't sustainable. Many of these minerals and elements are being used for our war adventures and technological enslavement. Why aren't professional societies and we as members calling this for what it is? Any comments?
I guess, my comment is that it's easy to ask our professional societies to take this up and move with it. I'm afraid that if we do, then, and I don't want to speak for any of the societies, but if we get more aggressive and do more what this comment's asking for, I'm afraid that then the politicians won't listen to us at all. And so I think that these societies are walking this nice line of trying to be in the middle and trying to present the science. And I mean, this is certainly the kind of job I have. I've got to really find this fine line between the science, and I've actually got to provide the science to both sides, both groups on both sides of the issue. And it's difficult when you're down in the trenches to have to deal with that. And so I think really industry's the big corporations, they're the ones that really have to start, trying to push for some of these changes. And it's not just in, the fact that clean energy isn't clean. It's a fact of how do we change some of these business models? How do we change and incorporate the social license to operate and the public demands on having clean mines, and yet get these mines financed and out into production in less than 10 years. I mean, I would argue with Sam that, certainly in my state, we're looking at well over 10 years. I mean, copper flat's been in production now for almost 15 years, and it's still not there. So, that's where I'm kind of coming from. I don't know if Sam, if you have any comments on who should be trying to get this through.
Well, one thing I will say is that 7 to 10 years is the statistics I find on the NGOs and the like. I think that number, Ginger, you're quite right, is perhaps affected by some small minds that maybe get through the process a little bit quicker. But definitely 15 years is not shocking to me, because that has happened before and will continue to happen. That we're talking delays of this magnitude. The other thing I wanted to address, just kind of more broadly about this here, is that about critical minerals policy being top down driven. I don't really agree with that. I don't think, the thing is that, there's a huge demand for these minerals, right? And it's going to continue to change. We're not going to meaningfully address the fact that there's a ton of demand for green technology, green as however you may care to define it. That's what people want. That's what the Paris Accord meetings want. Every company on the planet is trying to say something about the environmental, social governance policies there, about how they're investing in this green energy here. So this is a very broad-based demand we have here. And on the defense side, I think a lot of people see it as a non-optional demand we have to do. That there has to be greater investment in that regard. So this is something that's going to, demand for critical minerals is going to happen regardless of what we do, say, think, or happen, because it's just such a broad-based concern a lot of people have that it's motivating the concern for these minerals. I think, as Ginger mentioned, education and then sort of scientific argument about the uses of it and the sources of it like that will affect how that demand is particularized. But it's going to keep happening here. It's just a matter of how it gets addressed. The recent federal government reforms we've been talking about, in the Energy Act and the Fast 41, that has come after decades of concern from the industry about this process here. So far from being the critical minerals policy being top-down driven, I think a lot of this is us running after closing the barn door after the horse left 10 years ago. And this is a really deeply needed reform that have taken a long time to get here.
I would also like to add one thing too, and that is kind of an observation I've seen, is that if you kind of force, so I kind of feel like we've been forced to embrace solar panels and wind turbines. And when they first came out, they certainly were quite inefficient and quite ungodly to get into production and everything. But as we are starting to develop more and more of these systems, the engineers are now having a chance to work through some of the issues, and they're actually making these wind farms and solar farms far more efficient. So in the long run, this is certainly a good thing to go with, but at the same time, you still have to realize it is going to take a lot more minerals to be mined to make these wind farms and solar farms. And when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, you're not going to have any power, and you better have a base load, which means we also got to find a way to fund that. So it is more than just a top-down approach. The government certainly, kind of forces some of these technologies like electric cars. Eventually they're going to be here, but I think the engineers can solve a lot of the challenges that we're talking about, and so then it comes down to philosophical questions, and those end up being debated in society.
Today is actually I think it's today is the anniversary of SpaceX is founding there, and if you look at the history there, it's a lot of took a long time to get to the reusable rocket stage there too. And it's the same story for a lot of, as you said, Ginger, wind farms, and getting, efficient energy out of those. Took a lot of investment that was, took a lot of time that was, controversial at the time to some degree, to get to something that was meaningfully part of the energy mix and get it to a reusable rocket there. So a lot of these technologies we're talking about here are undergoing a lot of the same processes like that happen. So.
All right. Well, we have another question from Melissa Sanderson. She says, assuming a remarkable degree of political courage, if President Biden actually fully invoked the Defense Powers Act, could he mandate strict limits on each phase of the permitting process overall, which could result in a substantial reduction of getting to operations, that is 3 to 5 years instead of 7 to 10.
I would like to address that in one regard, in that every mine site is different. And it's easy to sit here and say, yeah, we want reasonable timeframes. We want permitting to happen in 2 years or less. But there are still the social license to operate, whether we like it or not. But more important, there are the environmental considerations. This is something that society, I'm not saying they're right or wrong, but do we really want a gold mine next to Yellowstone National Park? Do we really want a processing facility, say, next to Carlsbad Caverns? And those are extremes, but when you get down to it, everybody that lives in an area, a lot of people that live in their area, they think their home is Yellowstone. They think it is Carlsbad. And sometimes it's just going to take a little bit longer to get through hearing what the public has to say. And the public sometimes does bring to the table things that the mine operators may not understand. I often try to teach this to some of my students in class. And one of the interesting things that came up is that one area in New Mexico, when they started talking to the people that live there, one of the guys that was concerned about a mine opening up was the fact that he was a beehive. He had beehives. And he was saying, how would this mine operation affect my beehive? Well, I don't know that there's too many mine professionals that can answer that one way or another. And that kind of a question is going to take some time to answer. So whether we like it or not, some areas are going to take a long time to permit, and other areas should go a whole lot faster than what they are.
And on the question of using the Defense Production Act to address the permitting process here, I have to smile a little bit at the assuming a remarkable degree of political courage. I agree this question is deeply hypothetical, shall we say. But it's actually a difficult question. I'm not this immediately well versed on the Defense Production Act to say. I don't think that is a valid use of the Defense Production Act. I don't think that you could say the Defense Production Act is used to actually impose time limits upon agencies when they're considering these processes here. And again, consider that when we're talking about the agencies, we're talking about career employees. We're often not talking about political appointees. We're talking about people who've been doing this for 10, 20, 30 years in that process there, that are often not very impressed by exhortations to move faster or to that they're not doing their job properly. So I don't think the Defense Production Act allows that power, even if it did, or even if President Biden attempted to use some other power to mandate that kind of time limit there. My sense is that a court would still resolve that against an agency most of the time. The thing is that whatever President Biden does is obviously just an executive order. Is obviously just a unilateral from one branch of the government. Congress has still established the NEPA process. It has still established the Clean Air Act, and so saying to move faster in that time frame, you could demand the agencies do so. But at the end of the day, when you're getting judicial review, you're going to get courts that have said, okay, well, congratulations, you did it in 3 years, but you cut 4 or 5 different corners and you totally messed this whole entire thing up. And so back to the drawing board there. And I don't think that's something that the industry is interested in. I mean, moving faster is great, but if you move faster and you're just going to get kicked back after 3 years to start all over again under the 7 to 10 year time frame, has that helped anybody? I don't think that that's moving us forward in that regard there. So if there was a tenuous legal argument for it, perhaps there is. I'm not certain that is going to necessarily really get us what we're going for even there too, even if it kind of is a nice headline, a nice application of it in theory.
All right. Have a couple more comments from Don Cameron, who asked the previous question. He says, my question was in relation to the first talk, but the second talk was interesting too. And he also says, that's the difference between discipline and enabling. Government is the child. Corporations will not lead. If we are just feeding the pig as professionals, these organizations are just trade lobbyists. You don't necessarily have to comment on that.
Yeah, I would just, kind of add that, SME has a tax status that will not allow it to go and actually lobby for bills. That is the job of the American Exploration and Mining Association. That is the job of the National Mining Association. But a lot of these professional organizations, they really are not allowed to lobby because of the laws that govern their operations so that they can have tax status. And so we do have to be careful of that and cognizant of that. SME feels like our job, and this is what I've constantly been told, and I'm not a spokesman for SME, but certainly that's what got me involved with this webinar. SME, it feels like we're there to help educate not just the public and our members, but also to provide education to the legislature. So SME is not going to be lobbying for certain laws, even though we agree or disagree with them. That's the job of the lobbying organizations. But we do have a definite role in terms of education. And we also certify and actually provide the criteria and the definitions on how we um, have professional engineers, have certified professional geologists. So we do take a part in the certification and the process of providing these guys with the credentials they need in order to get their job done at boots to the ground.
I would say at this point that the Mining and Metallurgical Society of America is able to do some lobbying, and we have written letters supporting certain laws at various times or objecting to things in laws, like especially the mining law reforms that are being talked about. We don't have a large group that handles that, so what we do is we do it occasionally, but it's not one of our big things. The Women's Mining Coalition is very actively involved in discussing bills and other political processes. Okay, we have one more comment from Francisco Sotillo. And he says, coming from the comment of Betty, should we have more smelters that import polymetallic concentrates to keep the metals like indium, germanium, etc., for our industry instead of sending our concentrates? Some of the concentrates produced in the USA are not that rich in other metals, such as our copper concentrates. Also, many ores are processed using hydrometallurgy, which does not recover these metals. And you all may not have any more comments on that. If you do, that's fine. If you don't, that's fine too.
I think I would just like to add that it's a significant financial investment with a lot of social license tied to it, a lot of environmental issues tied to it to build new smelters. And I think it's just going to take somebody with the guts enough to do it. I often say that one thing that could help our nuclear energy is to actually have the small nuclear reactors go into a whole lot different areas, like in some of our cities. I mean, we're using these small nuclear reactors on the naval vessels with very, very little problems. There are always going to be problems, but it's going to take somebody with the guts and the gumption and the foresight to actually go and get it done. Once that first guy gets it done, then I think we can move forward. And I think the same thing applies here with building new smelters and large processing facilities.
Okay, that's all the questions. And I think we're going to close it down now. And thank you very much, Sam and Ginger, for all of your information and comments. We appreciate it. And Sam, yes, you are handsome. Yeah, we agree with that. So thank you very much. And
thank you
Susan,
all for listening and inviting us.
Yeah. And Susan, go ahead and give the final closing comment.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for attending and participating. The MMSA has a website. We post all of our webinars to the website. And so you can just visit us at our website and review this or tell somebody else about it if they haven't seen it.